everyone. So I'm going to, despite my 5 years at the Daily Mail, I'm going to try and be relatively optimistic, at least initially, in what I say. Very briefly, it is certainly the case that the UK economy looks like ending the year on a relatively positive note. Certainly the manufacturing numbers we had today were incredibly strong, the strongest manufacturing figures we've had for 16 years. So there's a real contrast, I think, in the fortunes of the UK economy over 2010. If you think back to where we were at the start, people were comparing us with Greece, not least the Chancellor making that comparison. And since then, the economy has clearly gained a little bit of momentum, despite the early cuts that have come through. Also interesting to track the fortunes of the Chancellor himself over a similar period. As Mervyn King reminded us in the papers this morning, a year or so ago, George Osborne was seen, along with his Tory colleagues, as lacking substance and inexperience, perhaps unsurprisingly, for an opposition politician. The mood has clearly changed in the city towards the coalition and towards Osborne in particular. He's now seen, especially I think this was encapsulated in the OBR statement, the autumn statement earlier this week, as being certainly at a strong point in his political career, and it'd be interesting to see how that evolves over the course of 2011. There are real question marks about the economy. Here's the end of the optimistic bit, and now into the question marks going into 2011. Certainly the GDP numbers that we've had have been built arguably on fairly fragile foundations. Construction has been a huge driver in growth in the second and third quarters. There's really no reason to expect that to be quite so strong in 2011. There is the fiscal consolidation, which we've heard very much about already, so I don't want to labour that point, but it is a massive 181 billion of cuts over the course of the spending review. And then the biggest question, which I think confronts us all as part of the European Union, being the fate of the Eurozone. The crisis there is really quite scary, actually, at the moment. From a personal level, it does remind me a little bit of the mood that everyone was in around the time of the Lehman, leading up to the Lehman crisis. It certainly feels a lot more worrying than the Greek crisis, when a period when actually policymakers were saying, well, this is the worst we've seen since the banking crisis. Well, actually, this feels worse than that, I think. I think more broadly, economically speaking, it is a period of extremes. Clearly, we have in the advanced economies a sense of debt-addled economies that are very much struggling to get out of that public and private debt, that really hanging over their fortunes. In the emerging markets, a really fantastically different story, and obviously a more optimistic story there, but also the question of overheating in emerging markets as well. I've been asked to give a checklist of things to watch in 2011. The first one, I think, which we all really need to worry about, will be the question of whether we could see the first default by an advanced economy for many, many decades. My suspicion is that probably won't happen, well, at least won't happen yet, but over the longer term there has to be a question mark as to whether the likes of Greece or Ireland can ever really repay that full amount of debt without restructuring the debt, i.e. allow either rescheduling its repayments or indeed writing down the value with the consequent implications that they have for the private sector and our pensions and the banking sector. The first quarter of 2011, we have a VAT hike to 20%. I don't think anyone can rule out that the economy could respond quite badly to that, especially because spending will be brought forward to the end of this year, especially the run up to Christmas. That could lead to a contraction in GDP. The Office for Budget Responsibilities numbers for the first quarter of next year are for fairly marginal growth in the economy, so it'd be interesting to see if that does happen, how that impacts the coalition's determination to push ahead with the cuts, and whether the opposition finally gets its act together on economic policy and puts forward a credible case, which makes for a bit of discomfort for Mr. Osborne. There is completely to contradict myself now, the question of interest rates and whether they will rise in the UK sooner than we expect. Certainly John Geeve, the former Deputy Governor, has said that once the bank starts to raise, it could end up raising much more quickly than anyone expects, and there are concerns about inflation expectations in the UK and the risk that the bank has to move quite rapidly. However, I think that's definitely a story for later in the year, if at all. The more immediate overheating question really is down to China, which is taking quite dramatic actions to rein in lending and to keep wages and inflation under control. Price controls on food prices, for instance, is a sign not of desperation but of real concern on the Chinese authorities. And to round it off, I think probably something which fascinates economic reporters and probably doesn't fascinate that many other people, is extremely geeky one, but it is a very important one, which is the future of the European Central Bank and the departure of Jean-Claude Trichet, and the question of who will replace him. It's an extremely political question, and a fascinating one, not least because Axel Weber, the Bundesbank president, has started to be seen as not very sound, and he was seen as the most likely candidate. Trichet will be a very hard act to follow, and there's the bigger question, of course, is whether there will be a euro for his successor to oversee.
On that cheerful note.